She screamed so loudly that the oak panels shook, and a thin thread of black saliva poured from her mouth. The faint light of the lamps flickered, illuminating the faces of the nuns pressed against the walls and the figure of the Pope, sitting in a high chair. The air was thick with the pungent smell of vinegar and old sweat. Prayers were whispered in a jumble, words slurred, punctuated by the doctor's short, dry commands. In the corner, on the stone floor, lay rusty knives, jars of fat, and thick rolls of cloth, ready for bandaging. Dad, gaunt and yellow, held a heavy cross as if it were his only support. His fingers trembled. His nails were dark, and blue knots of veins showed through the skin on his wrists. With every breath he took, he coughed, a dry, painful rattle coming from his chest. In recent months, he could barely stand, and rumors of his illness were already spreading through the palace corridors. They said that the sores on his legs had spread to the bone, that pus was oozing through the cracks in his skin, and that the smell could be smelled outside the doors of his chambers. But on this night, he ordered his chair to be moved to the monastery's bedroom so that he could personally witness the purification, the expulsion of carnal temptation from the bodies of young nuns. The incident that led to this ritual is described in one of the guards' reports. 2 of the sisters were caught embracing each other in the garden by the well. They were laughing, and their clothes were torn. In the atmosphere of the end of the century, when news of the coming judgment and signs of the end of days were constantly on the lips of preachers, such behavior came to be considered not only a sin, but also a direct intervention by the unclean. The Pope, who had been suffering from a fever for 2 months, raved at night, seeing images of fire and women's bodies. He told his confessor that lust was spreading like the plague within the monastery walls, and that it was the cause of his illness. Some of the cardinals close to him whispered that the illness was the result of contaminated blood after an unsuccessful bloodletting. The physician, following the custom of the time, tried to remove the rotten blood with knives and cupping glasses. The skin around the punctures turned black and the joints swelled. No potion could relieve the pain. The night of the ceremony began with the reading of psalms, but soon turned into loud cries. The doctor, who was nearby, kept a bag of opium with him, prepared in case the Pope lost consciousness. He had already attacked the servants 3 times in the last few days, accusing them of mixing poison into his drink. In the monastery bedroom, there were braziers with burning herbs, the smoke from which stung the eyes. The nuns, standing in a circle, coughed and lost their balance. The Pope, leaning on the arms of 2 deacons, approached one of the girls and placed a cross on her head. His voice was hoarse, almost breaking. He commanded the spirit of fornication to leave her body. The servants' reports say that by this point the Pope could no longer distinguish faces and at times seemed to be talking to himself. One of the deacons later wrote, "Looking at the girl, he said that it was not her, but the one who lay down in his bed every night to breathe his breath." The doctor ordered the smoke to be increased, hoping that the fumes would ease the convulsions of both him and the girls. But a coughing fit seized the Pope and he had to sit down. A trail of mucus streaked with blood remained on the pillow. Meanwhile, in Rome, there was already talk that the Pope's illness was God's punishment. Opponents among the reformers secretly passed letters calling him a rotten shepherd. The old cardinals, remembering the past years when he had ruthlessly persecuted heretics, were now making plans for his imminent death. The ambassadors of France and Spain were conducting secret negotiations, proposing their candidates for the Holy See. That night, the exorcism ended abruptly. One of the nuns fell, convulsing, and hit her head on the stone floor. The doctor bent down, but the Pope ordered him not to touch her. "The spirit is leaving." Another sister lost consciousness and began to gasp. Servants carried her out, leaving stains of blood and bile on the sheets. When my father was returned to his chambers, he asked that the door be locked and that no one be allowed in except his confessor and the doctor. The servants said that he did not sleep that night, but spoke quietly to someone who was not in the room. It was the first night that the smell from his chambers became so strong that the guards in the corridor had to be changed every 2 hours. The next day, he developed a fever that lasted for weeks, and rumors of the nighttime ritual spread throughout the city, heightening fears and expectations of the imminent end, not only of his reign, but also of the old order in the church. His forehead was hot as a stone heated in the sun, and his hands trembled, even as he tried to hold the cup of water. At dawn, after the ritual in the monastery bedroom, the Pope was unable to get out of bed. The doctor examined his legs and ordered the windows to be closed so that the smell would not spread through the galleries. Dark spots were visible under the skin of his shins, the edges of which were bursting, releasing a thick, greenish-yellow liquid. The bandages, changed morning and evening, were so saturated that they had to be burned so as not to cause the servants to vomit. A doctor's note, found later in one of the archives, read, "Body temperature is excessive, pulse is irregular, tongue is dry and cracked, the scabs on the legs are not healing, and there is a foul odor coming from the skin, indicating internal decay. Bloodletting and rubbing with vinegar mixed with crushed incense were recommended. But neither bloodletting nor herbal ointments brought relief. On the contrary, after each intervention, bleeding began, which was difficult to stop, and worms began to infest the wounds, as was common in those years with deep, purulent lesions. The Pope's entourage became increasingly restricted. Only 2 deacons, a confessor, and a physician had access to him. The cardinals began to demand an audience, but the palace guards, under the pretext of His Holiness's weakness, did not allow them in. This aroused suspicion. Secret letters, intercepted later, said that in the Pope's chambers, they weren't just fighting his illness, but also talking about his will, in which he was supposedly going to strip the oldest members of the Curia of their power in favor of younger ones who owed their careers to him. The palace walls felt like a fortress under siege. Ambassadors from France and Spain crowded into reception rooms, trying to get servants to pass on gifts, rare wine, fabrics, gold, in exchange for rumors about the Pope's condition. The confessor, previously silent, now increasingly summoned notaries to his chambers, but kept the records of their conversations to himself. One of the old cardinals, who saw the Pope through a crack in the door, later wrote, "I saw his face, yellow with sunken eyes, his lips cracked, and he stared at the ceiling, moving his fingers as if groping for something in the void." At that time, rumors spread throughout the city that the Pope's illness was punishment for a nighttime ritual in which he had defiled the innocent. Preachers in the streets spoke of sin, comparing him to the kings of ancient times, who had destroyed their peoples with their lust. The fever lasted for weeks. The Pope would fall into a stupor, then suddenly wake up, demanding candles to look at the face of everyone who entered. He increasingly said that the monastery walls were full of women whispering his name, and that these voices caused pain in his legs. The doctor, having no other means, ordered that his body be rubbed with a mixture of oil and crushed garlic, believing that the smell would drive away the spirits of disease. The servants complained that after nighttime fever attacks, his sheets were sticky with sweat and pus. They had to be burned in the backyard, and the ashes were taken outside the palace gates. In some morning reports, the guards wrote that it was impossible to stand guard in the corridors near the Holy Father's chambers for more than an hour without feeling nauseous. At this time, two camps had finally formed in the Curia: supporters of the old aristocracy and young cardinals appointed by the Pope himself. The former tried to spread the news of his infirmity, while the latter concealed it, fearing that premature elections would lead to the loss of their influence. But his illness could no longer be concealed. He did not appear at services, and his signature on official documents was increasingly replaced by that of his secretary. One of his closest servants, who was on duty at his bedside, left a note. Last night, he called for the same girl who fell in the monastery. He said she was sitting at his feet and whispering words I couldn't hear. He was crying, but not from pain, but from fear. By the beginning of the third week after the ceremony, the smell from the chambers could already be detected at the main staircase. Some servants demanded that his body be prepared for death. They stocked up on fragrant oils and prepared a lead coffin lid, but the cardinals ordered them to wait, fearing that this would cause panic and serve as a pretext for a riot in the city. The following days of illness further intertwined physical decay and political struggle, and ahead of him lay not only agony, but also open war for power, just outside the walls of his bedroom. In the fourth week, the illness ceased to fluctuate between brief improvements and decline. Now each day brought only new signs of decay. The physician no longer tried to hide from those close to him that the skin on the Pope's feet had turned black. When the bandages were changed, the skin came off in pieces, exposing grey-yellow muscle fibers. The smell was so strong that it could not be masked by incense or herbal smoke. With every touch of cotton wool or a rag, the Pope groaned and grabbed the edge of the bed, staring into the void. In the confessor's diary, preserved in the monastery archives, there is an entry. He told me that death was already in the room, but not in the guise of an angel, in the guise of a woman whom he had touched in his sleep, and who was now drinking his blood through his feet. These words were whispered in the corridors, and rumors of a curse of lust reached the city squares. Meanwhile, tensions were rising in the Curia. The senior cardinals gathered secretly in the homes of their relatives to discuss how to isolate the young party. They, in turn, maintained control over the chambers, not allowing anyone to see the dying man without their permission. The Spanish ambassador, having failed to obtain an audience, bribed one of the servants to obtain a letter describing the Pope's true condition. The letter described not only gangrene in his legs, but also seizures. He would suddenly start screaming that smoke was coming out of the wall, which smelled like those nights in the monastery. Every morning the doctor performed bloodletting, draining almost a mug of blood, claiming that this would draw out the heat. But the blood was thick, dark red, with an unpleasant, sweetish smell. After the procedure, the Pope briefly lost consciousness. His lips turned blue and his breathing became irregular. Seeing his condition, the young cardinals began to hastily agree among themselves who would get the key positions after his death. In one of his nightly notes, the servant mentioned, "Cardinal S. arrived with 3 armed men and tried to enter the bedroom. He was refused. An argument ensued, but the door remained closed. After that, a double guard, armed with halberds, was posted at the entrance to the chambers. The Pope himself became increasingly confused. He called the doctor by the name of his long-dead brother, accused his confessor of conspiracy, and asked for a knife to cut off the legs in which the devil lives. The doctor responded by increasing the dose of opium mixed with wine. But this only caused long hours of immobility, interrupted by sudden bouts of delirium. Strange things began to happen in the city. Crowds gathered at the palace gates, demanding purification of the church and praying for the speedy death of the accursed pontiff. Some monks spread stories that the ground beneath his bed had turned black and was infested with worms, even though he was still alive. At the end of the 5th week, his condition became critical. The skin on his cheeks was stretched tight, his eyes were sunken, and his teeth seemed longer due to his parched gums. Lying down, he would sometimes stretch his arms upward, as if trying to grab something in the air. His confessor claimed that he was catching the ghost of a nun who had died on the night of the ceremony in order to extract his sin from her. The cardinals of both factions no longer hid their hatred. Several times during the night, fights broke out between their men in the corridors. The guards' reports say that a page carrying medicine to the chambers was killed in one of these skirmishes. It became dangerous even for those who cared for the Pope inside the bedroom. Gangrene spread above the knees, and a dull, wet crunching sound came from the wounds, a sign that the decay had reached the bones. The doctor suggested amputation, but the young cardinals refused. It is not fitting to cut off the limbs of God's vicar. With each passing day, he became more and more like a wax figure. But even in this state, his power was a tool of struggle. Behind the bedroom doors, papers were already being drafted to take effect upon his death. But no one could predict whether he would survive another night or linger for weeks, keeping everyone in suspense. The smell became unbearable. Even thick curtains soaked in oil and incense smoke could not stop it from spreading. It seeped into the corridors, descended the stairs, and reached the inner courtyards. The guards, standing at the doors of the chambers, were changed every 2 hours, and even then, many refused to serve, citing bad air, causing headaches and nausea. One of the guards, questioned later, claimed that every breath was saturated with rot and hot iron. By this time, the doors of the chambers had effectively become the gates of a besieged fortress. Armed men stood on both sides, servants and confidants of various factions. The only way to get inside was with the personal permission of the 2 cardinals closest to the dying pope. The Spanish and the French factions in the Curia began to prepare their own lists of cardinals willing to vote for their candidates, while at the same time trying to push their people into the chambers to get the Pope's signature on his will. Inside the bedroom, the Pope was barely able to stand. His body was wasting away. The skin on his hands and chest was becoming transparent, and his veins stood out like dark ropes. The doctor stopped bleeding him, fearing that he would not survive even a few hours after the next session. Instead, they smeared him with a thick dark ointment made of resin and herbs, hoping to stop the spread of the ulcers. But the ulcers, on the contrary, rose higher up the body, eating away at his thighs. The bandages were now stained with a dark, almost black liquid in which gas bubbles appeared, a clear sign of deep tissue decay. A report by one of the deacons preserved in the archives states, "He spoke to a woman who was not there and complained that she was sitting at his feet, holding them, and that pus was flowing from her fingers." These words began to be perceived as a prophecy, and even among the servants, there were those who believed that the disease was not of earthly origin. Panic broke out in Rome. Crowds gathered at the gates of the palace, and some monks and city preachers openly spoke of the end of the corrupt shepherd, and threatened that if death did not come soon, it would be a sign of God's wrath upon the entire city. Merchants near St. Peter's Square began to close their shops early, and stories began to circulate in street taverns that women's laughter and the creaking of beds could be heard at night in the palace. Inside, the tension reached its peak. Twice in one night, the servants of the old cardinals tried to break into the room where the documents, seals, and keys to the archives were kept. Each time, they were stopped by armed men from the young cardinal's entourage. The confessor kept his distance more and more, his face pale and his hands trembling. Later, he confessed that he feared not only for the soul of the dying man, but also for his own. For at night, something was happening in that room that no human being should see. The servants who carried out the dirty sheets at night said that the fabric was so saturated with pus and sweat that when burned, it gave off a thick, acrid smoke that made their eyes water. Several of them fell ill and were removed from the palace. The Pope could no longer tell day from night. Sometimes he would remain silent for long periods, staring at the ceiling, then suddenly start screaming, calling for the nun who had died on the night of the ceremony. The doctor tried to give him wine mixed with opium, but sometimes he would spit out the liquid, muttering that it was poison from the cardinals. One evening, when it began to rain in the city and the corridors of the palace grew dark, several cardinals from the old camp gathered in a neighboring room and discussed aloud that if he did not die in the next few days, they would turn to armed groups of townspeople to break into his bedchamber and declare him unfit to rule. This news leaked out and caused a new wave of tension. Everything that happened during those days resembled the slow decay not only of the body, but of the very authority itself. The Pope, lying in his foul-smelling bed, no longer ruled anything, but his physical existence held back an avalanche, ready to descend on the city. No one knew what would happen when his heart stopped beating. But everyone understood that death was inevitable, and that chaos would follow. For the last 3 days, his body had not moved of its own accord. The doctor and deacons turned him over every few hours to prevent the wounds on his back from spreading even faster, but it was useless. The skin on his shoulder blades was cracked. Festering sores had appeared, and in some places, the bone could already be felt. With the fingers, the bandages were changed 5 times a day, but the smell was so bad that even those who were used to wounds and death turned their faces away and fought back the urge to vomit. He hardly spoke, only moaning occasionally and whispering prayers, interspersed with incomprehensible words, as if addressing someone invisible. The confessor claimed that in his last days, the Pope saw nuns who had died in convents during his reign standing around him. They stood by the walls of his bedroom and stared, without blinking, as if waiting for him to stop breathing. On the evening before his death, his temperature rose so high that the skin on his chest and face became hot as a burning stone. The doctor tried to apply a cloth soaked in vinegar to his temples, but it evaporated instantly from the heat. His breathing became rare, deep, with long pauses. When two cardinals from the camp of young people entered the chamber at night to make sure he was still alive, they found him with his eyes open, staring into the darkness. He did not respond to voices, only moving his lips slightly. An archival note made by a servant that night reads, "At about 4 o'clock in the morning, he took a deep breath, as if he wanted to say something, but only a wet rattle came out of his mouth. His eyes remained open." The doctor placed his hand on his chest, then crossed himself and said, "The pontiff is dead." After his death, his body quickly began to change. Within a few hours, his skin took on a grey-green hue, and his lips turned black. The doctor ordered embalming to begin immediately, but encountered a difficulty. The decay was so advanced that the tissue disintegrated under the knife. To slow down the process, lead plates were placed over the open sores and covered with a mixture of resin and wine vinegar. News of his death spread throughout the city by noon. Crowds gathered at the palace, shouting and demanding that the church be cleansed of vice. Some monks read psalms, others cursed his name. In the Curia, what everyone feared began immediately. The doors of the bedroom were thrown open, and people from both camps rushed inside to seize documents, seals, and keys. Several people were injured in the brawl, and one page was killed, stabbed in the neck. The French and Spanish ambassadors sent messengers with letters to their capitals on the same day, asking for immediate support for their candidates. Posters appeared in the streets with an image of the Pope with flames burning above his head, a sign that his soul was supposedly already in hell. Despite all measures, the pontiff's body continued to decompose rapidly. 2 days later, the embalmers insisted on immediate burial. The coffin, with a heavy lead lid, was carried out through a side gate to avoid the crowd and buried in a deep crypt under the cathedral. But death brought no peace. In the weeks that followed, the Curia split completely, and the struggle for the Holy See turned into an open political war between factions. The city was plunged into fear, and rumors that along with his body, the very cause of his death had been walled up under the vaults of the crypt, the female voice that called him at night. Thus ended the life of a man who had once held kings and princes in fear. And so began a new chaotic period in which everyone who had witnessed his final weeks remembered not the pontiff's greatness, but the smell of decay that wafted from his chambers.